I'm standing in the sun, and a monarch butterfly has just flown by me. I haven't seen one this year. I'm not sure when the last time I saw one in person was. And I was worried and feeling nervous and frightened, as I often do before I have to improvise. But most of the greatest ideas began with improvisation, and most of the greatest acts of human generosity and beauty, intelligence, and relation are improvisational. We don't know what to do. We didn't know ahead of time. Afterwards, we often don't even understand how we did it. As if we had a kind of special dream while awake, and came back with some kind of treasure, but a treasure that's not a commodity, a treasure that becomes ourselves and each other and our world, and its history and future. Lately, I think a lot about the idea, the metaphor, but not just the metaphor, the metonym of a compass. Because when we navigate in the world, we have to know things. And we used to have to know north and south ourselves, and east and west to some degree ourselves. And then a compass would help us recorrect that if we got confused. In our time, when we find our way around the world, often with the aid of machines and satellites, it's more of a cloud particle situation where you have coordinates. And they're not really connected to anything. They're connected to a world map and machines, and a very analytical, that is disembodied, position of orientation and orienteering. This is very dangerous because our minds become new minds very quickly. They transform rapidly. They're so flexible that they'll throw faculties away to work better in a domain of smaller dimensions. And we can't tell when we're throwing faculties away. We can't tell when our technologies that appear to be conveniences are changing us in ways we would never agree to, that will change what it means to be a human, to have a mind, to be intelligent, to be capable of relation, and many other things in our metabolism and the actual physical structure of our brains. Originally, living places were memory. You didn't have to have a memory. Your memory was associated with living beings and living places in every domain in particular, with no exception. There was no abstract position of relation at all. So living reality in relation was its own compass. You made a mistake, you were immediately corrected in 12 ways by living environments and living relationships. Now we have something else, and it's very confusing. And the living compass inside us, which is difficult to speak about, because it can work in any dimension, any domain, or multiple dimensions and domains at once. And it can even work with pure novelty. It can work with things it's never seen before. It can orienteer in domains that the mind is useless in, the thinking mind is useless in. Not only useless, dangerous in. Right? In novel situations, the thinking mind is not very useful. So if most of reality is novel, then the thinking mind has a very narrow framework in which its peculiar faculties and assets remain assets and faculties, and in domains beyond the boundary of where they are applicable, they are no longer assets. And since these domains are not easily seen, we don't have eyes in the places I'm talking about, we can't really tell the repercussions of our moves in the present or in the future. And even with our thinking minds and analytical minds, we're not very good at this in general, as we can see just by watching how humans play with representation in all the different ways they do it, and what the results of that play are as cultures and repercussions of systems of thinking, systems of analysis, comparison, evaluation, cataloging, relating data. For machines, all data is dead data. It's just numbers. Your coordinates have no meaning. Your body, however, is entirely different than that. And everything in nature is different from that. Everything, all the way down to electromagnetism. So the verbal fictions fall away. If you just look at physical reality immediately, you can see everything's got orientation. And it's fundamental, and there's many different domains of it for any phenomenon we care to distinguish with thinking and ask questions about. But inside us, there's a place where there should be a living compass, and for most of us, it's either missing, buried under layers of confusion and language and rules and ideas, answers to questions. Religions, sciences, declarations, authorities, responsibilities, jobs, proclamations, time constraints, ways of thinking. It's buried. From under all that mess, it doesn't know what to do or be. And so the person themselves, if they can be called a person, because a disoriented person is disoriented, and often disorienting, will really only be able to function in contexts that can absorb the damage of that. Unfortunately for our species, the environment can absorb a lot of damage. So we can offload the results of every kind of incredible, duplicitous, insane, ironic activity and idea and still call it success because we survived it. Well, we did. But we hid the damage 50 places in nature and each other and ourselves, in our own origins and future. So we actually didn't survive except in a kind of really abstract sense, right? We're still here. The body that had the idea wasn't killed by enacting it. In nature, you can't do that. In nature, you try to do that living in the woods, by yourself, in a hut, yeah? Or even with a small group. If you try to make a really bad mistake, it'll sting you right away. And you'll have to lie about it to pretend that you didn't cause it. And so this is a very peculiar feature of what happens when the compass is lost. When the compass is lost in ourselves or in our cultures, or when it's counterfeited, or replaced with layers of counterfeits which are often critical or judgmental, accusatory, prosecutorial, then it's impossible for anything to orient, and the results just become rolling waves of self-amplifying catastrophe and actual stupidity. Things we would never do because we've gone absent. We're missing from our culture, we're missing from ourselves, we're largely missing from each other. And where have we gone? Well, that's sort of an interesting question, but largely into structures and thinking and frameworks and words and rules and schemas of behavior, fictions of association, responsibility, activity, work, rushing. But what I want to talk about is actually a related topic. I want us to keep this idea of the compass at hand, and the difference between, for example, holding a compass in your hand, having one with you all the time so that when you walk around, rather than, say, a cell phone, no, an actual compass with a physical compass, not an electronic one. So that when you walk around, you can see that the magnet in the compass changes. And you'll know which direction is north and south and east and west. And you'll have some idea physically in your mind and in your body when you travel that you're changing orientations, which is something that GPS coordinates won't give you. Not that you can't put north, south, east, and west around them, but the problem is that the coordinates have precedence and are mechanical, and your relationship with north, south, east, and west is actually physical. It's not an idea. So how do we orient, and what are all these fake compasses that are layered on top of ours, and how does this all get set up? There's a lot of different ways to talk about it, but a toy I want to use here is an amphitheater. Because over time as children, we learn to assemble something like a coliseum. And it has, in my model, in the toy I'm making of it, this isn't real. We're just making a toy of something like maybe how we feel inside, or sometimes how we see. It's like there are rings of people around us watching us. And we imagine them. So that even when we're in a room, we might imagine our friend or our parent either with us or, thinking through something with them, or imagine conversations. We might recall a conversation. We might imagine ourselves being seen and seeing another or others, especially in the play of children. We've often heard a child declare, "Mommy, Mommy, watch me, watch me." And there's something very beautiful and profound and unusually intelligent and instructive happening in that signal. The child is authentically demonstrating that, and not just in the sense of an actor or a performer, but in a really deeply relational sense. When we're together, we are much more. And when the child feels his mother watching and enjoying his learning and his growth and his play, or hers, they both exchange and receive and amplify a benefit for which we have no name, but it becomes intelligence. And it becomes true relation. So there's a compass orientation in there, right? Which is that we develop really beautifully and at a very accelerated pace in an environment where we imagine ourselves surrounded by positive, encouraging, not merely spectators, but people who are participating in our development, as if our development is their development, is our development. So that it's not an economy where one person's teaching and one person's learning, but it's more as if there's a person in a circle of people, small, say 7 people, and this person is perhaps on the stage at the moment doing and learning the tasks, but all of the people in the ring are learning together, even if one of them appears to be leading and some appear to be following. That will change in a moment, and a new person will enter the center or the root, the pivot of the compass, right? And so it's as if we make a kind of compass inside ourselves, isn't it, of imagined spectators. And this is so provocative and powerful that modern internet technology has taken advantage of this and reified it in incredibly crude and dangerously purposed constructs that we call social networks. And like our GPS devices, these are transigenic. They reforge our minds when we relate with them. They're much, much more powerful than a drug, and they're at least as provocatively addictive, but in ways that permanently change our behavioral and relational structures and don't appear superficially as a deadly or dangerous intoxicant or developmental peril. But for many people, they are and will be. For many people, their experience of using machines and the internet will reforge their inner amphitheaters and put in there things that should never be in there. Authorities surveilling their every typed word and analyzing their every spoken word in every communication that they make, in every context. What happens if you put that authority in the inner amphitheater? What happens? What happens down where the play takes place? What if you're always recording a child and it always knows it's always being recorded? Will it become human? Can it? What happens when you replace a living observer with a mechanical observer that represents not just one fictional collective or authority, but any possible fictional collective or authority for any possible purpose? What happens when we do that? I want to preserve this question very provocatively. So what is the whole idea of this amphitheater? Well, long ago it was really interesting. Mountains were really, really important to everyone, and we traveled to and up and around them. At least some of our peoples did. And most of our religions actually come, almost all of them, from mountain people experiences. The Bible has to do with a particular mountain on earth, one. It's the experience of one people of that mountain, and much more, indeed, than that mountain. But it's a physical place. It's not a story far away, right? It happened on this mountain. It is about this mountain. This is the special mountain of all mountains. And in each of the places on earth, there were mountains like this, and the people made things like mountains, and like inverted mountains. And the mountains were orienting points on a compass, but it wasn't a compass like you and I have ever seen. It was a compass of such incredible intelligence and sophistication that it would be very, very difficult for us who think in terms of technology frameworks to imagine anything like it. It was a non-ordinary compass of impossible and beautiful sophistication, a living compass. It led to a door in the sky. That door is still there. But what happened in the cities was different. What happened in the cities was they forgot about the mountains, and they started making both representations of mountains and representations of the inversion of mountains, amphitheaters. And amphitheaters were understood as a cone that would call the door, the spirit gods down from the sky in a conical ring, right? Which is why the seats are arrayed that way, concentrically, inwardly from above to the bottom in some amphitheaters. It also provides excellent viewing opportunities of the stage from a circle. Rarely were they composed in squares. Not never, but it's less common. In any case, the idea was an inverted mountain, right, that would actually call down, like a feminine version of a mountain, the gods and the people, not just the gods, but the spirits of origin, the sun, the moon, the stars, the ancient spirit of life on all the worlds, would invite it down to become us. Yeah? And the people in the center, whatever was happening, would become transformed. And this cone would focus all of the attention of the sky and all of history, of all of time, all the beings, all of nature, all of mankind, the past and the future, would focus it down to this point where, quote, the action would take place, unquote. Now, this meant very different things in very different contexts, and some of those things were completely ridiculously absurd. But long ago, before all this was corrupted, the idea was actually really interesting. And by the way, there are two sorts of kinds of amphitheater, right? One where all the people in rings are arrayed above someone, for example, down on the field. And this is how our minds usually simulate it. There are rings of authorities, culture, religion, perhaps parents, and there are both. There's like a good amphitheater and a bad amphitheater, or the amphitheater has both kinds in it, right? It's got good critics and evil critics. Good encouragers and evil encouragers, right? So it's spotted, it's cloudy, this amphitheater, with dark and light elements. And since they're not real people necessarily, they're mostly figments in a kind of psyche, right? They're real people in our lives, but when we feel the effects of the amphitheater, it's usually that we're simulating it in our hearts or our psyche, whether we see it directly or not. Whether this is an image in us or not, we feel, oh, these people are watching me, or I'm being observed, or does she see me? We're curious about who's watching all the time when we're just in life. But when we're in thought, the amphitheater is much more real. And none of us were taught that we make minds, we develop minds and psyches, humanity and or intelligence, if it's possible for us, in direct relation with this idea, right, this metaphor, this metonym, that represents our relationship with history, nature, all the humans we've ever met, all the cultures we've encountered, all the critics and encouragers, and all the strangers. So originally, before there was an amphitheater, there was something really amazing. Without any specific necessary religion or ritual, people would make a circle. And they would know that in making the circle, however small, and usually it probably was relatively small, especially long ago, they would first imagine that all of the sky and all of the history of life on Earth was coming to live in them now, coming to join them now. So they would see and feel, think and be the living spirit and memory of all of that history, and all of the history of the people, all of it, not just theirs, all of it, and all of the history of the sky and the animals, and all of the history of the living places, and all the history of the people and beings they had known and loved, their enemies, their friends, everything, was in the circle now, as if they'd been invested with the Spirit themselves, each one of them uniquely and yet completely. And from this position, perhaps one or two or three might enter the center and begin to orient and reorient, or to seek something, an answer, to question, or to play, to just play, to be human. But what was in the amphitheater wasn't spectators, and what was in the center wasn't actors. The center became the soul of the ring. And elements from the center would depart into the ring, and elements from the ring would rise into the center. And we had a living compass. And when we made the circle, we knew that this is what we were really doing in every other thing. And so the circle became a compass, and not a courtroom, and not a battlefield, not a circle of judges and critics, but rather something intelligent like a hand, that in reconnecting with the signals coming across the wrist into it, signals of its own origin, signals of its own intelligence, they wanted to make sure the hand didn't become disconnected from that wrist and start telling stories and counterfeit the circle and disorient the compass, and then lay one disoriented compass on top of another, just like we see in many ancient cities where they had both pyramids and probably amphitheaters or something like them, or the pyramids were the amphitheater. You can make a reverse amphitheater, right? You just put the sacrifice, or the being that's about to be made divine by being destroyed for everyone, at the top. Now, the figure I just made is a bit crude, but in the cities, what you got were representations of the compass that we used to make and be together when we lived in and on the land, with and for each other, the history and future of life on Earth, which is the only really way we can be human. Even if we're living in cities, we can live this way to some degree. And we can still orient this way together and remember how. But what happened was the people in the cities, their compasses didn't work. And the people who were roaming around on the outside, just follow me and pretend I'm talking about the Bible or the Native American Indians or the South American Indians, because it happened in similar, if different ways on each continent. The people who were roaming around had a living skybook, and the people inside the cities had a dead skybook. And so the people who were roaming around had a living relationship with time, which is much stranger than anyone in the cities can ever hope to imagine, and much stranger than physics, and alive, and light, which is the same, and all of living places, and every organism, every creature, they knew them intimately, not categorically, not abstractly, as parts, not as parts, as aspects of themselves. And they knew that each thing they saw lived inside them. Not theoretically. Not like us, not like we might think that or make a religion about it. No. So they could orient and were oriented in living relation. But inside the cities, all the compasses went bad. Real bad. And the cities had to wipe out and dominate any open terrain just to keep themselves running. Right? Just to kill enough animals and make enough grain and cut enough stone and feed enough slaves to build that pyramid and build that amphitheater. And what's in that pyramid? One person? The entire civil defense budget of the United States was spent to protect one man. One man. In other countries, the civil defense budget is spent to protect every single person. Every person. There's a nation, I'm not sure which one at the moment. It could be Sweden or Scandinavia, Norway. Forgive me for having forgotten. And I may not even. It may be a country I didn't mention, but one of the nations near those has a civil defense plan. It's astonishing. Every person has a shelter in their house, and they go to each other's houses and shelter with each other all the time, so that really, and they have like hospitals built inside mountains, right? It's all hidden. You can't see any of it on the outside. But the whole culture has incredible resources, so that if anything ever happened at all, anything, not only would everyone be protected, but everyone could protect each other and would, because they practice doing that all the time. So they have a compass, and the compass is each other. It's not a fiction. And if their government were to become tyrannical, they wouldn't have a chance against their people. No, I wouldn't even have the opportunity to try to hurt them. They're so strong and so unified that if their government went haywire in any way, the government would have a very, very difficult time imposing any kind of tyrannical authority on these people at all, under any conditions. They are independent because they are interdependent, and without that interdependence, they can't be independent. They're just isolated. And under those cities, you're going to find, in many cases, older cities buried where they did the same thing and it didn't work. And it wiped them out. In every case, it wiped them out. And it took a lot of nature and other living beings with them, because these cities, they need slaves, man. And you know where they get them? From the people who aren't in the cities. They get them from the people on the land, right? Especially a long time ago. So they would just go capture whole tribes of people and enslave them to build pyramids and amphitheaters and things. Huge statues. And they'd enslave these people for hundreds of years, and every once in a while they'd escape and write a skybook. Like, for example, the Jews did. So you can see that the whole amphitheater thing becomes an inward construct in our psyches. We build an amphitheater of dead critics and imaginary authorities that don't exist at all. They're all fictions. And then trying to understand ourselves or orient ourselves inside an amphitheater where all from above we're being constantly crushed and misdirected and laughed at and criticized and lied about and lied at and declared to, which, you know, begins in childhood, right, with the shadow. That is probably our first encounter of the shadow, our first encounter with the shadow of culture, which, you know, often is going to happen in our parents and siblings first. It's going to happen real close to home before we get a taste of the actual complexity and impossible, threatening danger of what we presently call culture and our relationships with language, knowledge, identity, and intelligence. And nowhere will we be given any authentic orienteering hope. We're going to have to preserve it almost alone, if we're going to have any, or invent it, which is, of course, what we're going to have to do now, together. But for most of us, we just establish a really terrifying amphitheater of critics, and for some of us, life becomes nothing but that. Critics and judges. And then, you know, we can see ourselves directing this at others. I can certainly see this in myself. But there's a different kind of amphitheater that you can make. You can make an amphitheater like the old one. Inside yourself, you can replace the crappy courtroom of the endless concentric rings of deadly and pernicious, nonsensical, grumpy, lying, analytical authorities with the living compass of your heart and true relationships with yourself, your dreams, being alive, consciousness, intelligence, learning, growth, development. What's going on here behind and underneath all these overlays is so terrifyingly beautiful. We're actually afraid to get a taste of it and would prefer, for example, orgasm or a psychedelic experience. Thank you. But that's because if we were to get a taste of it, especially together, it would be so provocatively, unremittingly exciting and beautiful that our relationships with language and identity, knowledge and culture wouldn't be able to survive it very long, even if we were still within them. And we can do that now, together, just by understanding some of the features of how our relationships with representations, ideas, figures in our minds, language, thought, rules, authority, are confused. And reorienting together, we can learn what it means to inhabit the circle rather than be subject to it or invented by it. And we can learn what it means to inhabit and have meaningful roles and agency in intelligent unities rather than duplicitously toxic fictions. I know it sounds almost impossible or shocking, or like if they could have done this before they would have. No, it's not true, and many did and died beautifully doing this. We've remembered some tiny portion of them, but most of them are traceless in history. And that's, in some sense, more beautiful than if we remembered them, and more true. They live in the spirit of possibility, unspoken in language or form, unframed in representation. They live in the promise of our human birth, an actual orientation and relationships with nature which are beyond anything science or religion has dared to suggest. So the promise is of a frontier of our humanity that's been buried, a frontier of human potential and intelligence that's getting buried in new ways and new dimensions. It's inventing new ways to bury itself each moment. And we can become subject to this, or we can become human, alive. We can make the living compass inside us, and we can replace the amphitheater with the history of life on Earth. The history of life on Earth is with us. And singing with our own mouths, moving with our own legs and hands. The history of all the people, all their dreams, all the mothers, all the fathers, every child that was ever born is alive in you right now listening. The history of time-space, all the beings, the sky, origin itself, the stars, the sun, the moon is watching. In that bird you hear in the background, we're touching the origins of life on Earth this instant. It's not enough to think about relationships, or time, or light, or physics. It's not enough to make frameworks that tell us what intelligence looks like, because any such framework is immediately self-conflicting. Above all frameworks, with and for each other, learning and growing, discovering what it means to be and become human together, inventing it, improvising it, beautifully, truly, for purposes that matter, that are in our hearts and in nature, will become a compass. We can't live without it, and the substitutes don't work. When we disappear into pure relation for a beautiful purpose, such as learning or seeing and discovery, or solving a deadly problem together, then we begin to discover what it means to be individuals, because only then are we surrounded and contexted, encompassed by, and feeling viscerally alive and real, and not made of thoughts and ideas and functions. The spirit of our birth is heroic by nature. It wants to be true and amazing and noble and human, intelligent, articulate, skillful, creative, playful. It's desperate for a context in which to authentically personate, to be born. Instead, we have a kind of fake shell of self that we wear around that is mostly the armor that allows us to survive contact with the constructs and some kind of whatever inner amphitheaters we may or may not have assembled. So I'd like to think of this as an invitation to remember and discover other ways that are older and truer compasses that work, and minds that are oriented in relation and nature and intelligence and learning, rather than in declaration, tyranny, compression, depersonalization, and which are themselves depersonating, which then require we impersonate something, since we've been depersonated and now. So we can't live this way. And I like to think of this as an invitation, which I hear in the song of the bird in the background, to personally and communally rediscover the human art of orienteering together, in life, in language, in the constructs, in everything we do. And to bring some living spirit back into the center of that ring, and back into its constituents. And to dismiss the fictional authorities, to dismiss them from our inner theater, where often to ourselves we play as some aspect of our minds plays as if to an audience and receives its suggestions or praise or criticisms or derision, joyful laughter or cruel laughter. I'd like to dismiss all those fictional authorities and judges and inner senses and clear the amphitheater. Let's put something beautiful and true there that we trust together. Let's learn how now. Perhaps today we've made a beginning. Tomorrow we shall go 4 times further, and the day after that 40, and so on, and so forth, and so far.